$1 million says you can't start it, she said. The crowd laughed. Diane Ashford stood in the center of the Harrington Invitational Car Show, surrounded by $60,000 worth of catering and people who had never worried about $60,000 in their lives, and pointed at the matte black hood of her car like she was pointing at something disposable. $1 million. Marcus Webb heard the laughter and said nothing. He was standing 20 feet away, near the edge of the crowd, wearing a work jacket that didn't belong in this room, holding a glass of water he hadn't asked for because a passing server had handed it to him before he could say he wasn't a guest. He had come here because an acquaintance had told him Diane Ashford's car was at the show, and he had wanted to see it. He had not planned to be seen. He'd built that engine. Every machined surface, every toleranced clearance, every decision about ignition timing and fuel mapping, he had made those choices at a workbench in a lease shop in Charlotte 3 years ago, under a ghost contract that paid him well and required him to sign a non-disclosure and never contact the end buyer directly. He had shipped it in a foam-lined crate addressed to a logistics company. He had never met Diane Ashford. He had never seen the finished car until tonight, and she had just bet $1 million that no one in this room could start it. He thought about Owen. He thought about $95,000. He set down the glass of water. Drop a comment where you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this story reaches. The Harrington Invitational was held annually in a converted aircraft hangar on the grounds of a private estate outside Greenwich, Connecticut. It was the kind of event that described itself as intimate in the invitations and then had 300 guests. The cars were displayed on polished concrete under gallery lighting, each one roped off, each one lit to show its best angle, each one belonging to someone who had either inherited the money to buy it or had made more money than they knew what to do with, and had discovered that this was one of the things you could do with it. Marcus had driven up from Waterbury in his work truck. He'd told the valet he was a vendor, which was not true, but was close enough to the right kind of truth, because he did have a reason to be here, and it did involve the cars. The valet, who had been told there were vendors, had waved him through to the side lot without further examination. The crowd that surrounded Diane had the particular texture of events like this one. People who knew each other from other events, from boards and foundations, and the specific geography of serious wealth, who circulated through the same rooms over years and developed the ease of long familiarity without always being close. Conversations were light and referential, full of shared knowledge. Names were dropped with casual precision. There was a man by the Italian cars who Marcus later learned was a former senator. There were 3 people who had been in last year's Forbes list. There was a woman who had been in 2. None of this registered as remarkable to anyone except Marcus, who was standing at the edge of all of it with a water glass and no business card and his work jacket, and for whom the room's specific social texture was as foreign and readable as any mechanical system he'd never worked on before. Interesting, not intimidating. He'd been in rooms like this before, not often, and not as a guest. The Sotheby's work had put him adjacent to wealth without putting him inside it. He'd been the expert, the man the wealthy consulted, which was a specific kind of room access that conferred authority without membership. He understood how to carry himself in that position. You were present as a function, not a person, which was its own kind of freedom. He'd carried that quality into this room, and it had made him invisible in exactly the right way. Until Diane's eyes had found him. He'd walked in through the service entrance and stood near the back of the room for an hour, looking at the cars. There were 11 vehicles in the main display. He recognized most of them. 2 Italian supercars, 1 barely street legal. A pre-war roadster in cream with red leather that had clearly been the result of a very good restorer's work. A Bugatti that had been modified in ways that made Marcus instinctively uncomfortable. 3 American muscle cars, varying levels of authentic. A McLaren that was the most expensive car in the room and also the least interesting. And then hers. He'd known it the moment he walked in, which wasn't entirely rational, because the engine wasn't visible, and the car had been built around his work by a coach builder in Germany whose aesthetics he hadn't had any input into. But he'd known it anyway. The stance, the particular way the hood sat, something about the proportions that corresponded to what he'd imagined when he was doing the engineering. It was a custom commission. The kind of car that didn't have a mark, didn't have a production number, existed as a single thing in the world, because someone had wanted a single thing in the world and had spent accordingly. The body was matte black carbon fiber over a hand-formed aluminum frame. The interior, visible through the driver's window, was Alcantara in graphite and copper. The whole car had the quality of something that had been thought about very carefully for a long time. His engine was under that hood. He'd stood near it for 20 minutes, keeping his distance from the rope, not touching anything, just looking. The detail work the German coach builder had done was excellent. The engine access panel was in exactly the right place for the intake clearances he'd specified. The hood ventilation matched what the thermal modeling had predicted. Someone had listened to his specifications and done good work. He'd been thinking about leaving when the crowd shifted. Diane Ashford had arrived. He'd looked her up online the previous evening, when the acquaintance had mentioned the Invitational in her car. He'd wanted to know something about the person who owned what he'd built. The results were extensive. Diane Ashford, 42, founder and CEO of Ashford Systems, a data infrastructure company valued in the upper 11 figures. Born in Phoenix, raised modest, 3 semesters at Arizona State before leaving to start the first version of what became Ashford Systems in a spare bedroom. Driven, competitive, precise in her public statements. Twice named to the Forbes list. On the cover of 2 business magazines in the last 14 months alone. In person, she was smaller than the photos suggested and had the particular quality of very powerful people in informal settings, a way of occupying the center of any room she entered without appearing to try. Her dress was understated. Her watch was not. The people around her arranged themselves instinctively, conversation arcing toward her like sunflowers toward light. She made a circuit of the room. She stopped at each car and said something to the owner or the handler. She was engaging and specific, which meant she actually knew something about what she was looking at. She was not performing interest. She was interested. She reached her own car last. The crowd had thickened around her by this point. These things happen naturally at events like this. The gravitational pull of money and attention. Someone offered her champagne. Someone introduced a man Marcus didn't recognize. She shook hands, said something that made the small crowd laugh. Then she leaned against the rope barrier of her own display and looked out at the room. Her eyes found Marcus. Not in a charged way. The way eyes found anything that was slightly out of place. He was the only person in the room who was wearing a work jacket instead of a sport coat. He was the only person standing alone. He was the only person not holding champagne. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked away. Someone in the crowd, a man in a blue suit who had the loud cheerfulness of someone who drank at these events with professional dedication, said, "What does it take to get that thing running? I've been asking all night." "You couldn't get it running," someone else said, laughing. "I'd give it a try," said a third voice. Diane Ashford smiled. It was a specific kind of smile, the kind that went with a decision that had just been made. She looked around the room. Her gaze traveled back to Marcus. $1 million says you can't start it, she said, not to the room. To him. Any mechanic in here thinks they can fire up a $500,000 custom commission. I'll write the check right now. Her voice carried easily. She was someone who knew how to use a room. $1 million. The car doesn't get touched by anyone who can't prove they know what they're doing. But if you can start it, you walk out of here with my check. The crowd laughed. Marcus stood there in his work jacket with his glass of water. He'd built the engine that was in that car. He'd built it over 7 months in a leased shop in Charlotte, starting from a blank design document and ending with a running prototype he'd tested on a dyno rig 3 times before being satisfied. The ignition sequence was non-standard. He'd built a bespoke ECU mapping that required a specific start protocol before the engine would fire. It wasn't an anti-theft measure. It was the result of the way he'd tuned the idle compensation and the way the fuel trims needed to be set before initial crank. The car wouldn't start with a standard key turn. It needed a sequence: accessory on, wait for the fuel pressure to build to a specific value, blip the throttle twice to seat the idle valve, then crank. No one would know that unless they'd built the thing. He set down the water glass. "I'll take that bet," he said. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something unexpected happens. Diane looked at him. "And you are?" "Marcus Webb. I'm a mechanic." Her expression said she'd heard that, had assessed it, and had arrived at a conclusion. "A mechanic," she said. "From where?" Waterbury, something moved in her expression. Amusement, and underneath it, the faint condescension of someone who had not expected to be taken seriously by someone in a work jacket. "You understand what kind of car this is," she said. It wasn't really a question. "I understand the car. It's a custom commission, one of a kind, built around a completely bespoke engine package. The man who designed that engine doesn't even know what it's in right now." She looked at the crowd, letting them enjoy the moment. "You think you're going to walk up and start it. I think I'm going to walk up and start it," Marcus said. The crowd hadn't been this quiet in an hour. Diane Ashford looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in her expression. A recalculation. A brief consideration of whether this was going to be entertaining or just embarrassing. "Okay," she said. "Let's see it." Marcus Webb had grown up in a garage. Not metaphorically. Literally, his father had run a repair shop in Providence, Rhode Island, a 2-bay operation in a neighborhood where most of the customers paid on credit, and some of them paid in kind: groceries, help with the yard, a favor banked against some future need. It was an honest shop doing honest work, and Marcus had been in it after school from the age of 8, at first handing tools and watching, then doing simpler tasks, then doing more complex ones as his father recognized that his son had an unusual quality of attention when it came to engines. Not just mechanical aptitude, though he had that. The quality was something harder to name. A way of hearing a running engine and knowing what was wrong with it. The same way a musician could hear a core chord and identify a flat note. He could listen to a cold start and know from the pattern of the idle catch whether the fuel trims were off, or the timing was slightly retarded, or the injectors needed cleaning. He could read the smoke from a startup the way other people read text. His father had noticed this early and had been systematically, deliberately useful about it. He'd handed Marcus technical manuals when Marcus was 12. He'd sent him to a community college automotive program at 16, not because Marcus needed the basics, but because Marcus needed the credential and the formal vocabulary. He'd paid for him to go to 2 weeks of advanced engine building seminars in Ohio when Marcus was 18, spending money they didn't have easily because he could see what his son was capable of and understood that capability without development was just potential. Marcus had done the rest himself. He'd spent his 20s building engines. Race engines first, the grassroots motorsport world where you showed what you knew by what you built and then ran it at the track and let the results speak. He'd been in the paddocks of regional series and then national series, and then, through a chain of introductions that happened when you were consistently right about things, he'd found himself consulting for a manufacturer's development program. Not the name on the car, the engineering firm that did the actual work under contract. That was how the world of bespoke engineering operated. The people whose names were on things were not always the people who built them. There was a whole ecosystem of engineers who worked under confidentiality, who designed and built and specified and tested and then signed documents saying they hadn't, whose work went into other people's products with other people's names on them. It wasn't unusual. It was standard practice in the world where one-of-a-kind things were made. Marcus had been part of that world for 6 years before Owen was born. He'd pulled back when Owen came, the same instinct that had driven his exit from the Sotheby's equivalent of his field, the same recognition that what he was building needed to be at home, needed to be present, needed to be there when a child came home from school with a question or a problem, or just the ordinary weight of a day that needed somewhere to put itself. He'd opened the shop in Waterbury. He'd done good work for ordinary customers. He'd kept up the engine-building side through private commissions that let him work on his own schedule, not manufacturer work anymore. Not the big-budget proprietary stuff, but individual builds for collectors and racers who knew his reputation and could find him. 3 years ago, a broker had approached him with a commission. A private client. No name given, the broker had been upfront about that. The client wanted a custom twin-turbo V8 to be installed in a coach-built commission they were having built in Germany. All specifications to be designed and executed by Marcus. Budget, no limit within reason. Timeline, 14 months. Requirement, full ENDA and no direct contact with the client before, during, or after. He'd done it. He'd taken the commission and done the work and signed the ENDA and shipped the completed engine in a foam-lined crate. He'd received wire payment and a brief acknowledgement from the broker that the engine had arrived. He'd never known the client was Diane Ashford until the previous evening. The 6 years of contract work had been the best preparation and the most rootless way to live. He'd built engines no one else was trusted with. He'd developed a reputation in a community that operated on silence. The community of people who built one-of-a-kind things for people whose names were on other things. He'd been excellent at the work and invisible in everything else. When Owen's mother had told him she was pregnant, he'd been in the middle of a 9-month project in Charlotte. He'd put the phone down and stood at his workbench and thought, I'm going to go home. Not home to a place he hadn't had a home to a place in 5 years. Home to a way of being. Home to the kind of life where a child could count on knowing where you were. He'd finished the current project, settled up with the broker, found the shop in Waterbury, signed a 3-year lease. Owen's mother had made her own decision about 2 years later, and they'd separated without drama. Owen had stayed with Marcus, which was the outcome that made sense given that Marcus was the one who had built the permanent thing. The ghost engineer had become a father. The man who moved from shop to shop under silence agreements had become someone who came home at the same time every day. And the engine he'd built alone in Charlotte under an ENDA he'd thought would be permanent was about to become the pivot on which $95,000 turned. He walked toward the car. And he'd never known, until tonight, that the bespoke ignition mapping he'd installed as a function of his specific tuning methodology was the thing that stood between a $1 million bet and the humiliation Diane Ashford had been setting him up for. She was good at this. He could see that clearly. The setup had been instantaneous and efficient. Spot the out-of-place man in the work jacket. Make the public challenge, watch him fail in front of 300 people who would all remember it. It would have been a good story. The Waterbury mechanic who thought he could start a $500,000 custom commission. The thing she didn't know was that the $500,000 custom commission was more his than it was hers. He knew the start protocol because he'd written it. He knew the fuel pressure threshold, the throttle inputs, the specific ECU initialization sequence, because he'd designed all of it from a blank page. He knew exactly why the car wasn't starting for anyone else who'd tried, because he was the only person alive who understood what he'd built and why. In the morning, he needed to call Owen's school to arrange the early pickup for the appointment with the spinal specialist. He needed to call the insurance company again about the pre-authorization for the surgery. He needed to sit across a desk from a doctor and hear a timeline and a cost breakdown and find a way to keep his expression steady, while the number settled over him like a weight he'd been carrying for so long he no longer noticed its shape. $95,000. After insurance. After the payment plan the hospital had grudgingly extended. After everything he had. Which was not nothing. He had savings. He'd been careful. But was $62,000 short of what Owen's surgery required. $62,000. He looked at the car. At the matte black hood over the engine he'd built. At the rope barrier Diane Ashford had just unclipped and set aside, gesturing for him to approach with the particular graciousness of someone who expected to watch a public failure. He walked forward. Owen James Webb was 9 years old and had been diagnosed with tethered spinal cord syndrome at age 6. The diagnosis had come the way the important ones always did, through a process of elimination, through the quiet accumulation of small signs that each individually might have meant nothing, that together meant something specific and serious. Owen had complained about leg aches that everyone had attributed to growing pains. He'd had an episode of weakness in his left leg that lasted 3 days and then resolved, and that the first 2 doctors had called a viral thing. He'd been slow to reach some milestones in ways that were within the range of normal, which was how they'd been filed, into the range of normal by people who hadn't yet had occasion to see the whole picture. The MRI had been ordered by a pediatric neurologist who was more cautious than the ones before her, and who had looked at Owen's history with the specific eyes of someone who kept the differential wide until the evidence narrowed it. The MRI showed exactly what she'd suspected. Tethered spinal cord. The filum terminale, the strand of tissue at the bottom of the spinal cord, was abnormally thick and was tethering the cord to the base of the spine instead of letting it move freely. As Owen grew, the tension on the cord increased. The leg aches. The weakness episode. The subtle things that didn't match up until the picture was complete. The pediatric neurosurgeon had been direct about what came next. Surgery, detethering procedure, cutting the film and releasing the cord. Routine in the sense that neurosurgeons did it regularly and outcomes were consistently good when it was done before significant damage occurred. Not routine in the sense that it was spinal surgery on a 9-year-old child and required a specialist at a center that had the right team and the right equipment. The right center was in Philadelphia. The gap after insurance was $95,000. Marcus had known about this for 4 months. He'd spent those 4 months in the specific sustained exhaustion of a single parent running calculations on every possible variable. Second mortgage, personal loan, crowdfunding, payment plans from 3 different financial offices. A call to his brother in Seattle that he'd made with a dry mouth and had not needed to repeat because his brother didn't have it to give. He'd been working every hour the shop could generate. He'd taken on 3 private commissions beyond his normal capacity. He was, in the precise accounting of it, $62,000 short with no clear path to close the gap on a timeline that the surgeon had said shouldn't stretch past spring. Owen didn't know the details. He was 9. He knew about the surgery. They'd had that conversation, carefully, at a level of detail appropriate for a 9-year-old, which meant the facts without the fear and without the financial arithmetic that Marcus was managing alone. Owen had processed it in the way that children process difficult medical news, with a seriousness that sat alongside the ordinariness of his life rather than replacing it. He still cared about his soccer team. He still had opinions about what was for dinner. He still wanted to show Marcus things he found interesting on his tablet at bedtime, animal videos and space photographs, and once an extended segment about the manufacture of ball bearings that they'd watched together, with shared, sincere appreciation. He was a good kid, a genuinely good kid, the kind that made you feel you'd done something right without being able to identify what it was. The morning before the Harrington Invitational, Marcus had packed Owen's lunch and walked him to the corner where the school bus stopped and watched him climb on. Owen had turned back at the top step and done the wave he always did. A small wave, efficient, not a big production. Marcus had waved back. The bus had pulled away. He'd stood at the corner for a while afterward. He'd thought about the acquaintance's message from the previous night, the tip about the Invitational and Diane Ashford's car. He'd looked her up. He'd recognized the car from the photographs, the commission he'd built the engine for, the ghost contract from 3 years ago. He'd thought about it for most of the day. Not a plan exactly. more the recognition that the world had arranged something specific in front of him, and that the question was whether he was the kind of person who noticed arrangements like that and acted on them. He was, it turned out, exactly that kind of person. He'd stood at the corner for a while after the bus pulled away. He did this sometimes, not out of worry exactly, but out of the particular attention of a parent who understood that time moved in a direction and that mornings like this one were the texture of what he was building. Not every morning mattered individually. Collectively, they were the whole thing. He'd gotten back in the truck. He'd driven to the shop. He'd done the day's first job. A brake inspection on a Civic that turned out to need front pads, and the driver had known it, but wanted to be told officially before authorizing the work, which Marcus understood as a reasonable way of being sure. At 6, he'd closed the shop and driven to Greenwich. He'd called the shop, told his assistant to lock up at 6. He'd driven to Greenwich with the intention of simply seeing the car. He had not had a clear plan. He had had the specific knowledge of what he'd built, and a number in his head and a child who waved goodbye from the top step of a school bus and needed $62,000 worth of surgery by spring. He hadn't planned the bet. The bet had found him. Now he was walking toward the car that had his engine in it, with 300 people watching and a woman behind him who was very confident she'd just humiliated someone she didn't know. He put his hand on the door. "Do you need a key?" Diane said from behind him. There was laughter in her voice. "Is there a key?" She reached past him, a point made with the gesture, and pressed the start button on the fob into his hand. The fob was modern, biometric, the kind that cost more than his monthly shop rent. It unlocked the door. He sat in the driver's seat. The interior smelled of leather and Alcantara, and something he identified as a specific grade of carbon fiber sealant he'd smelled once before. In the German shop photos he'd been sent during the build. The seat held him at the right height. The wheel was exactly where he'd calculated it needed to be for the engine access geometry he'd specified. He could feel the car around him the way he felt every car he'd ever built something for. Not ownership, something more specific, familiarity. The way a maker knows what they've made. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment before touching anything, the way he always sat in a car he was about to work with. Just being in it, getting the specific quality of it, the way the seat was mounted, the sight lines, the angle of the wheel, the temperature of the interior which had been closed up and was cool in the way enclosed spaces were cool. He listened to the silence of it. An engine that wasn't running had its own kind of presence when you knew it well. He could feel, in an almost physical way, the mass of what was under the hood, the precision of what he'd assembled. He thought about Charlotte, the shop, the dyno rig, the months of work. The first cold start he'd done after completing the assembly, the particular quality of attention you brought to that moment. Every choice you'd made for the previous months about to prove itself or reveal its flaws. He'd sat in a shop chair to the side of the test stand and listened to it come up. It had been exactly right from the first cycle. He'd sat there for a moment after it stabilized, listening to it idle, and had felt the specific satisfaction of work that is complete. It had sounded like this, exactly like this. He pressed the fob start. Nothing. Diane, watching through the window, allowed herself a small smile. This was the part where every other person who'd tried this had failed. The car accepted the fob signal, the electronics came alive, the dash lit up, the gauges moved through their startup sweep, but the engine didn't turn over. It sat there with all its readiness displayed, and no crank, no fire. 300 people who thought they were about to watch a Waterbury mechanic embarrass himself. Marcus sat in the seat and looked at the gauges. Fuel pressure. Building. Right where he expected it. He waited. 3 seconds. 5. The fuel pressure reached the value he'd specified in the ECU map. He pressed the throttle twice. 2 short inputs. Not aggressive. Just enough to seat the idle control valve the way the programming required. Then he turned the key. The engine caught on the first crank. It didn't roar. It didn't make a production of itself. It came up through the idle in the specific smooth progression he'd tuned it for, the way he always tuned cold starts, gradual, controlled. The idle stabilizing and then settling into the quiet authority of an engine that was exactly right. The car was running. The room was completely silent. Marcus sat in the driver's seat and listened to his engine. It sounded exactly like he'd planned. He shut it off, got out, handed Diane the fob. She was looking at him with an expression he recognized from the faces of people who had just had their fundamental assumptions about a situation rearranged. "How did you do that?" she said. Not a question. The statement of someone working backward from an effect to find a cause that made sense. "The throttle blip," Marcus said. "Before you crank. The idle control valve needs to seat or the cold start enrichment doesn't sequence correctly. The engine won't fire without it." "How do you know that?" He looked at her. "I built it," he said. The silence in the room lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then, because rooms like this didn't stay silent and because there were 300 people present who had all heard the exchange, the sound came back in a wave, not the polished murmur of before, but something more agitated, more interested. The particular energy of a gathering that has witnessed something unexpected and is now processing it. Diane Ashford's expression moved through several things in rapid succession. Disbelief first, which was the natural response to a claim that large. Then, a sharp analytical intelligence coming to bear on the claim she hadn't built a company worth 11 figures by being easily fooled, and she wasn't going to be fooled now. Then, under that, something Marcus couldn't fully read, something that moved quickly across her face and was gone. "You built it," she said. The statement required unpacking, and she knew it. The engine. Ghost contract. 3 years ago. Broker named Stern. "I received payment via wire transfer from an LLC called Meridian Fabrication." He could see her recalibrating. Meridian Fabrication was the broker's shell. The name would mean something to her if she'd been involved in the purchase. The specific detail was too precise to be invented. That contract was under a non-disclosure agreement, she said. "It was." "Which you just violated." "That's a question for lawyers," he said. "The immediate question is whether you intend to honor the bet." Another pause. The room was listening to every word. That was the situation. Diane looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned to the crowd. Her expression had shifted into something controlled. The professional composure of someone who understood that everything happening in the next 30 seconds would be repeated in every conversation these people had for the next 2 weeks. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, and her voice carried easily, trained for exactly this. "It appears I owe someone a check." The crowd made the sound of 300 people appreciating a graceful recovery. She turned back to Marcus. Up close, the composure had a seam in it. Not anger exactly. The specific displeasure of a person who does not lose and has just lost. "I'll need your information," she said. "Of course. And your attorneys." "Why my attorneys?" "Because we're going to have a conversation about the ENDA before any money changes hands." There it was. He'd known this was coming. Not in the exact form. He hadn't known about the timing. Hadn't known she'd invoke it immediately. But he'd known the ENDA was the complication. The thing that stood between the bet and the check. She would not simply write $1 million to a man who had just publicly violated a confidentiality agreement she'd paid for. "My attorney will be in touch," he said. He left the building the way he'd arrived. Service entrance, side lot, his work truck sitting there among the catering vans where it had been parked for 3 hours. He drove out the crushed stone driveway, back onto the county road, back toward the highway. He called his brother in Seattle from the car. "Not about money this time. I might have a situation," he said. "What kind of situation?" "The legal kind. I need the name of a good contracts attorney." His brother, who was an engineer, not a lawyer, but was the kind of person who knew people who knew things, gave him a name within 4 minutes. He called the name the next morning. Her name was Claire Whitfield. She had her own practice in Hartford, 12 years, specialty in contract and IP law. She had a specific kind of voice on the phone, direct without being aggressive, the voice of someone who asked the right questions and waited for complete answers before moving to the next one. He gave her everything: the commission details, the broker, the ENDA, the invitational, the bet, Diane Ashford's invocation of the ENDA as a bar to payment. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. "Can you send me the ENDA documents? They're in my files. I have a copy." "Good, I'll read them today." A pause. "One preliminary question. The engine. Did you design it from scratch?" "Yes, blank page design. I built everything from my own specifications. No pre-existing designs, no adapted work, nothing. It was entirely original." "Is there documentation of the design process? Notes, CAD files, testing logs?" "Everything. I'm meticulous about documentation." Good. He could hear her already thinking past the ENDA. Most standard NDAs in this kind of commission govern confidentiality, not intellectual property ownership. The question is whether the contract transferred IP rights in the design to the client, or whether it only required confidentiality about the work. Those are very different things. What's the difference in practice? If you retained IP rights in the engine design, then the engine is yours in a specific legal sense regardless of who it's installed in. The ENDA might govern whether you can discuss it publicly, but it can't transfer ownership of your own intellectual work without explicit, compensated IP assignment language. And most brokers writing commissions like this don't include that language, because they don't know to. He sat very still. "Read the ENDA," he said. "I'm reading it now," she said. "I'll call you this afternoon." She called him at 3. "The ENDA governs confidentiality," she said. "There is no IP assignment clause. There is no work for hire language. The commission was structured as a service contract. You are being paid for labor, not for intellectual property. The design of the engine is still yours." He thought about what that meant. "The confidentiality clause," he said, "is triggered by disclosure of the work's existence and the client's identity." A pause. "Disclosing at the invitational. Were you the one who identified Diane Ashford as the client? Or did the context make that clear independent of your disclosure?" He thought back. He'd said, "I built it." He hadn't named the contract. He hadn't named her. She had been present. The crowd had drawn their own conclusions. The ENDA threat had come through email 2 days after the invitational. Not from Diane Ashford's main legal team, from a firm Marcus hadn't seen before. One that identified itself as counsel for a related business interest, and sent a letter that was formally structured as a reminder of his contractual obligations, but read, in its practical effect, as a warning. The language was careful. Nothing explicit. Just the architecture of a legal threat with the threat implied. Marcus had read it twice, and forwarded it to Claire without comment. Claire had called back within the hour. "This is a pressure move," she said. "They're trying to establish that you've violated the ENDA before you've had a chance to make any formal claim. If they can get you on record acknowledging the violation, they create leverage they can use to avoid paying the bet." Who sent it? The firm is connected to Meridian Fabrication. The broker. Marcus had thought about that. The broker, Stern, the man he dealt with on the commission, had set up the commission structure in the first place. If the ENDA was being used as a weapon, Stern had an obvious reason to cooperate. The ENDA's enforcement clause had probably been written to protect the broker as much as the client. Can they actually prevent payment on the bet? They can try to complicate it. They can't prevent it if we move correctly. Claire's voice was steady. "We respond to this letter today. We do not acknowledge any violation. We state that the legal determination of what occurred at the invitational is an open question, and that we are prepared to litigate if necessary. And then we wait for them to decide if they actually want to take this to court, or if they were just hoping the letter would scare you off." He'd thought about what it cost to be scarable. about the specific calculus of people who used legal pressure not because they were right, but because they'd learned that the cost of fighting back often exceeded the cost of backing down. He was not, he'd decided, a person who backed down from things that were true. Send the response, he said. The response had gone out that afternoon. The silence that followed it had its own quality, not empty, but full of other people's thinking. He'd gone about his week. He'd done the work. He'd made Owen's lunches and attended the parent-teacher conference, and replaced the struts on a 2019 Subaru that had been riding wrong since its previous owner took it off a curb at significant speed. The broker had not responded. Diane's primary legal team had. Their response had been the settlement offer. He thought about all of it later, in the specific reflective way of someone who has been through something significant and is now at enough distance to see the whole shape. The end threat had been the escalation he'd been expecting. The settlement offer had been faster than he'd expected. The terms had been better than he'd expected. He'd built $1 million engine under a ghost contract, and it had sat in a car in a woman's collection for 3 years, running perfectly, completely unknown to its maker. And then the world had put him in a room with it, at the exact moment he needed what it was worth. And the woman who owned it had, after everything, chosen to handle it with more integrity than the initial setup suggested. He thought about the specific architecture of how things worked out. Not always, not reliably, not in any way that you could plan for. But sometimes. Sometimes the thing you'd built with your whole competence met the moment you needed it to. Sometimes the engine started on the first crank. I said I built the engine, he said. She was standing right there. Then the disclosure was arguably contextual rather than explicit. The ENDA's confidentiality trigger requires you to actively disclose client identity and commission details. Standing in front of the car and saying you built the engine while the client is present is a much grayer area than sitting down and telling someone who your client was. She paused. Their lawyers will argue it violated the spirit of the agreement. My argument is that it didn't technically trigger the clause, and that even if it did, the clause is unenforceable because it was used to facilitate a potentially fraudulent situation. The bet. How so? Diane Ashford made a public bet that no one could start a car that is designed with a non-standard ignition sequence that only its original engineer would know. If she knew the car had a bespoke ignition protocol, and she would have because she commissioned the car, then making that bet in public was knowingly setting up a contest no one could win without inside information. That's closer to fraud than it is to a fair bet. Marcus sat with that for a moment. She didn't know I was in the room, he said. That doesn't change the nature of the bet. She knew no one in that room would be able to start the car because the car was engineered not to start without a specific sequence she'd never made available. Will that argument work? It's an argument, Claire said. Whether it works depends on what she does next. If she's smart, and from everything you've told me, she's smart, she's already having this exact conversation with her own lawyers. She's trying to decide whether fighting you over the ENDA costs more than paying the bet. He stared at the ceiling of his shop. There's one more thing, he said. Tell me. He told her about Owen, the diagnosis, the surgery, the gap. The line was quiet for a moment. How long do you have? She said. Surgeon said not past spring. That's about 4 months. Yes, okay, she said. Her voice hadn't changed. Still direct, still precise, but something in it had settled in a way that told him she understood the weight of the timeline. We're going to move fast. I'm filing a letter of intent to collect on the bet by end of week. I'm also going to send a notice about the IP ownership of the engine design, which creates a separate track of pressure. Diane Ashford's lawyers will advise her that fighting on 2 fronts simultaneously, the bet and a potential IP dispute over her own car, is significantly more expensive and uncertain than writing the check. He thought about Owen waving from the top step of the school bus. Do whatever you need to do, he said. Claire Whitfield filed both letters by Thursday. And then the waiting began. The specific, grinding kind of waiting that happened when lawyers were involved and timelines were being set by forces outside your control. Marcus went to work every day. He changed oil and diagnosed the complaints of ordinary engines and drank his coffee from the same mug he'd been using for 6 years. He picked Owen up from school. He made dinner. He helped with homework and listened to the soccer game updates and watched the space and animal videos at bedtime. He told Owen nothing. Owen, who had the specific perceptiveness of children who had spent significant time in medical waiting rooms and had learned to read adult faces for information that adults were trying to withhold, knew something was happening. He didn't push. He just watched. They had an understanding, Marcus and Owen. Not spelled out, not formalized. Just the working agreement of a father and son who trusted each other enough to let things exist in their own time. One evening, 3 days after the letters had been filed, Owen said, "Is it about money?" Marcus looked up from the bills he'd been going over. "What makes you ask?" "Because you look at numbers sometimes." Owen gestured at the papers. "Like that. And you get the same face as when you told me about the surgery stuff." He put the papers down. "We're working on it," he said. "Working on what?" "The money for your surgery." Owen thought about this. He was a careful thinker. He processed things fully before responding, which Marcus had recognized early as a quality worth respecting, and had tried to give him space to do. "Is there enough?" he said finally. "We're getting there. How close are we?" Marcus looked at his son. "Closer than I thought we were a week ago." Owen absorbed this. Then, "Is it because of the car?" Marcus blinked. "What do you know about the car?" "I found an article online about the show. Someone posted a video." Owen looked at him carefully. "Was that you?" "The video. Someone in the crowd had been filming." Of course they had. Someone had filmed the whole thing, and it had made its way to whatever corner of the car enthusiast internet cared about such events. "Yeah," Marcus said. "That was me." Owen was quiet for a long moment. "She looked surprised," he said. "She was." "Was it scary?" "A little." Owen nodded slowly, turning something over in his mind. "But you knew you could do it." "Yeah, I knew." His son looked at him with the particular steady regard of a 9-year-old who has been given, over years, enough straight information to trust the person giving it. "Okay," he said. "I believe you." He got up and went back to his tablet and his space photographs and his excellent 9-year-old ordinary life, and Marcus sat there in the quiet of the kitchen and thought about being believed by the person who mattered most. Diane Ashford's lawyers called Claire Whitfield on a Monday morning. Claire called Marcus at noon. "They want to negotiate," she said. "What are they offering?" "A settlement agreement. The bet payment in full, $1 million, in exchange for a comprehensive release of any IP claim on the engine design, an extension of the ENDA to cover all future disclosures, and a clause requiring you not to publicly characterize your role in the car's creation." Marcus was in the shop. He had a car on the lift and a customer waiting on a call he hadn't returned. He stepped outside into the cold parking lot. "They're offering to pay the bet." "Yes, all of it. All of it. But the IP clause and the public characterization restriction are significant. You'd be permanently giving up the right to claim you built the engine, in any context. To anyone." He thought about that. The settlement was efficient. The settlement was clean. The settlement would fund Owen's surgery with room left over. The settlement was also Diane Ashford buying his silence in a way that was structured to appear like a legal formality. He thought about the IP clause. He'd retained the IP in the engine design. Claire had been clear about that. The commission had been a service contract, not an IP transfer, which meant that legally, in a specific sense that mattered in the world where this kind of work was done, that engine was his. The most sophisticated piece of engineering he'd ever done, installed in a car valued at $500,000, driven by a billionaire who had used it to humiliate a stranger at a party. And it was his. He wasn't sure the money was the point. "What happens if we don't settle?" he said. "Then we litigate. We file the IP ownership claim formally. We argue the ENDA violation case. We let a judge decide whether the bet was fraudulent and whether the ENDA's confidentiality clause was triggered by what happened at the Invitational." A pause. "It takes time, though, probably 6 months to get a hearing date." Maybe longer. 6 months. Owen's surgeon had said not past spring. Spring was 4 months away. He stood in the parking lot and thought about the specific distance between what was right and what was necessary. "Is there a middle position?" he said. "Between settling and litigating? Between handing her the IP rights permanently and fighting it out for 6 months while Owen's surgery date slips?" Claire was quiet for a moment. He could hear her thinking. There might be. They want the IP clause because they don't want anyone to be able to claim they own a piece of what's in their car. But an IP license is different from an IP transfer. If you license the design to her, grant her a permanent, exclusive right to use it in that specific vehicle, she gets what she practically needs without you surrendering ownership entirely. And the public characterization clause? I can push back on the scope. You shouldn't be required to lie about your professional history. There's a difference between not publicly marketing your involvement in her specific car, which is a reasonable privacy protection, and being prohibited from noting in professional contexts that you've done bespoke engine work at this level. He thought about it. He thought about Claire arguing in a conference room somewhere while Owen's surgery date moved later and later. He thought about a clean version of this that honored what actually happened without becoming a fight that lasted longer than they had. "Here's what I want," he said. "Full payment of the bet. IP license, not transfer. She can use it in the car. I retain the design rights. The ENDA can stay intact for her specific identity and the specific commission details. But I retain the right to note, in professional context, that I build bespoke V8 work at this level of specification. No specifics. Know her name, know the car, just the category of work I do." "That's a reasonable position," Claire said. "And I want documentation of the engine design in the final records. Not public, not in press materials, just in the provenance file. Honest records. Also reasonable." A pause. "I'll take it to them." She called back in 48 hours. "They accepted," she said, "with one modification. They want the IP license to be exclusive and irrevocable, meaning you can't license the design to anyone else. They don't want an identical engine appearing in another car." He'd been expecting something like that. That's acceptable. The design was built for that specific platform. I'd never use it in another application anyway. Then we have a deal. The 48 hours between Claire's counterproposal and Diane's lawyer's response were the kind of time that passed and didn't pass. Marcus went through the motions of the shop, the oil changes, the diagnostic work, the ordinary commerce of keeping the operation funded, while another part of his attention sat quietly with the knowledge that somewhere in a conference room he'd never see, lawyers were arguing about numbers and language and the value of an engine he'd built. He'd been through enough complex situations to know that the waiting was the part you couldn't rush. The work before the waiting that you could control, you could be meticulous about. You could prepare as well as possible and then set it down. The waiting itself was just waiting. Owen had a soccer game that Thursday, one of the winter indoor league games, gymnasium floor with painted lines, the particular chaotic energy of kids running in an enclosed space. Marcus sat in the bleachers with the other parents and watched Owen chase the ball with the careful movement he'd been managing for months, staying in it, competitive, finding ways to play around the limitations his body imposed without being fully aware he was managing around limitations. His son scored a goal in the second half. Not a spectacular goal. A simple tap-in from 2 feet out after a teammate's shot deflected. But a real goal. Counted. Celebrated by the teammates around him. Owen ran back to his position with the modest satisfaction of someone who understood that a goal was a goal. Marcus watched him. He thought, by spring he'll be able to run without thinking about it. He'll be able to play without the compensation. He thought, I'm going to make sure of it. He drove home with Owen talking about the game, the plays that had worked and the ones that hadn't, the opinions that 9-year-olds have about the tactics of their peers with absolute confidence and very partial information. Marcus listened and asked questions and navigated home in the dark. He was an ordinary man driving his son home from soccer. He was also a man waiting for lawyers to resolve a $1 million dispute about an engine he'd built alone in a rented shop 3 years ago. Both things were true at the same time. That was most of life, actually, the large things happening inside the container of the ordinary ones. The settlement agreement was executed on a Thursday. The wire transfer hit his account that Friday. $1 million. He sat in his kitchen and looked at the number on his laptop screen for a long time. Then he called the Philadelphia hospital and told the financial counselor that he was ready to finalize the payment arrangements for Owen's surgery. Then he called the surgeon's office and asked about the earliest available date. The earliest available date was in 6 weeks. He wrote it in the calendar on the kitchen wall. February 14th. He'd written other important dates on that calendar: school events, appointments, the occasional birthday. This one he wrote carefully, the way you wrote things you wanted to be sure of. Owen came home from school at 3:30 and dropped his backpack and went to the refrigerator in the normal way, and then stopped and looked at the calendar. That's a new date, he said. That's your surgery date, Marcus said. Owen turned around. He looked at his father with the specific quality of attention he brought to important information. Did you work it out? Yeah, I worked it out. Owen was quiet for a moment. Is there enough? He said. The same question from a week ago. Yeah, there's enough. His son stood in the kitchen with his hand still on the refrigerator door and absorbed this. His expression was not relief exactly. It was something quieter. The settling of something that had been held at a specific tension for a long time. Okay, he said. He got an apple out of the refrigerator. He sat down at the kitchen table and started his homework. Marcus made coffee and watched his son do math problems and said nothing for a while. Some things were worth doing quietly. He'd built something alone in a shop in Charlotte 3 years ago under a contract that required silence and had never expected to see the result. He'd signed the documents and shipped the crate and gone back to Waterbury in his ordinary life. He hadn't planned for any of this to happen. He'd just been thorough. He'd just been meticulous. He'd just kept his documentation and known his own work, and been in the right room at the right moment with the right knowledge. Preparation and circumstance. Meeting at a specific time and place. That was all any of it ever was. The part Marcus hadn't anticipated was the news. Someone had filmed the Invitational. Or several someones. Different angles had turned up on different platforms. The short clips passed around in the specific way of content that has a clean narrative. Public challenge. Underdog. Impossible seeming task. Clean execution. 300 people had been there. All of them with phones. All of them connected to other people who liked cars or underdog stories or both. By the time Claire filed the initial demand letters, the story had already left the room where it happened. By the time the settlement was executing, it was on 3 automotive news sites and 2 general interest publications. By the time the wire transfer cleared, it had been picked up by a national outlet that described Marcus as the anonymous engineer behind a mystery custom engine and spent 4 paragraphs speculating about what else he might have built. He didn't talk to any of them. Claire's settlement agreement restricted him from discussing the specific commission. He had nothing specific to say in any case. What happened was simple. He'd been at a show. He'd started a car. The details were what they were. He referred every inquiry to Claire's office and let her handle the questions that needed answering. What he hadn't expected was the calls from Diane Ashford's people. They came through Claire, properly, formally, a request for a meeting. Not adversarial, not legal, A request from Diane Ashford herself, through proper channels, to meet with Marcus Webb at a time and location of his choosing. He talked to Claire about it. What does she want? She didn't specify. The request was for a conversation. He thought about the expression on Diane's face at the invitational. Not just the composure coming apart when he started the engine, the calculation he'd seen afterward when she'd invoked the ENDA, and then the specific expression, harder to read. When the settlement had reached terms she hadn't expected to be as reasonable as they were. Okay, he said. They met at a coffee shop in New Haven. Neutral ground, mid-morning, the kind of place busy enough not to feel conspicuous. Diane was there before him, which he'd expected. She was dressed casually, or as casually as someone with her resources dressed, which meant expensive clothes deployed without apparent effort. She had a coffee and a notepad and the look of someone who had prepared for this meeting, which he respected. She stood when he came in. They shook hands. They sat. "I want to apologize," she said, immediately, without preamble. He hadn't expected that. At the show, she continued, "I made the bet because I thought I had no way to lose. I knew the car had a non-standard ignition, and I knew no one in that room would know the protocol. I thought it was amusing." Her voice was level, not quite flat. It was using information asymmetry to set someone up to fail in public. "That's not something I'm proud of." "You didn't know I'd built it," he said. "No, but it wasn't a fair bet regardless." She looked at her coffee. "I've won a lot of unfair bets in my career. I've called it strategy. I'm trying to be more honest with myself about what that actually means." He looked at her. At the particular quality of this apology, which was not performed, it was something she'd worked out privately and was delivering because she'd determined it was the right thing to do, not because she needed something from him. "You didn't have to come here to say that," he said. "I know. The settlement's already done. I know that too." She met his eyes. "I'm here because I wanted you to know that I heard what you built. I had the engine evaluated by 2 other engineers after the settlement. Both of them said the same thing. The design is exceptional. The execution is exceptional." A pause. "I've spent a lot of money on that car, and I've never actually talked to the person who made the most important part of it. It seemed like an omission." He wasn't sure what to say to that. "The bet's going to follow me," he said eventually. "The story." Yes, she looked like she'd accepted this. "That's fair, actually. I'm not trying to hurt your reputation." "I know." She picked up her coffee. "The story that will follow me is accurate. I made a bet I thought I couldn't lose. The person I made it against turned out to know the answer I didn't know they knew. I paid the bet." She put the cup down. "That's not a bad story, honestly. It ends with me keeping my word." He thought about that. About the specific shapes of things and how they could look different from different angles. "What did you need from this meeting?" he said. She looked at him directly. "I wanted to tell you in person that what you built is extraordinary. I wanted to say that without a legal document in the room." A pause. "And I wanted to know if you'd consider building something else." He looked at her. "Another commission," she said. "With a real contract this time. Your name on it. No ghost work, no broker intermediary. I want a second engine built to your specification, for a different platform. I'll pay fairly, and I'll do it right." He thought about Claire's advice on the settlement, about what it meant to retain IP rights, about what it meant to be known for what he'd done versus being the anonymous engineer behind someone else's car. "I'll think about it," he said. She handed him a card. It had her direct number on it. Not a corporate operator, not an assistant. "That's for when you decide," she said. They sat for a while longer. They talked about the car, the German coach builder's work, the thermal management choices, the parts of his design that had behaved exactly as expected, and the one part that had behaved better than expected, which he was curious about, and which she described in enough detail that he was able to identify what had happened and why. She knew how to talk about engineering. Not at his level, but enough to have an actual conversation rather than a performed interest. He found himself genuinely engaged in the technical discussion in a way that didn't have anything to do with the $1 million or the ENDA or any of the events of the previous weeks. It was just the work. Two people talking about a piece of work that was very good. He'd built it alone in a shop in Charlotte and shipped it in a foam-lined crate and never expected to discuss it with anyone. He was discussing it now. How long did the build take? She asked at one point. 7 months of active work. A month of testing and refinement. The testing logs you have. Every dyno run. Every parameter change. I have the full history from initial prototype to final spec. She nodded. Something in her expression was specific and satisfied. Those should be in the provenance file, she said. That was in the settlement. Documentation in the records. I want to add to it. The build logs, the design notes. I want the full story of what's in that car in the car's history. She looked at him. I'm not going to pretend I built it. I bought it. There's a difference. The technical conversation had lasted 40 minutes, which was longer than either of them had planned. She'd asked about the turbocharger selection, why he'd gone with the specific units he'd chosen rather than the alternatives that the platform's typical builds used. He'd explained the considerations, the spool characteristics, the compressor map, the specific RPM range where the car was likely to spend most of its operating time given its weight and intended use. She'd listened with the focus of someone who wasn't yet fluent, but was close enough to follow, who was tracking the logic even when the terminology required inference. You matched it to the driver, she said at one point. He'd looked at her. What do you mean? The RPM range. You said you thought about where the car would spend most of its time. You were thinking about how it would actually be driven, not just what its peak specifications were. You always design for the use case. He said, a car that's only fast at the top of its range is a car that spends most of its time being less than it could be. The interesting problem is making it feel right across the whole range. She'd made a note on the notepad. He'd noticed she'd been making notes throughout the conversation. Not performatively, actually recording things she found useful. The secondary fuel system, she said. Is that your design, or did the coach builder add that? Mine. Part of the thermal management strategy. They almost changed it. He'd looked up from his coffee. Almost? In the build process. Their standard approach would have routed it differently. Their lead engineer argued for it. She looked at her notepad. I told them to follow your specifications. I didn't know why at the time. I just knew that the engineer we'd contracted had done the work with more documentation and more evident care than anyone I'd seen, and that changing his work without his input was probably a mistake. He'd sat with that for a moment. The decision she'd made without knowing him, from documentation alone. The documentation he'd been meticulous about because his father had taught him that work you couldn't account for was work you couldn't stand behind. You made the right call, he said. I know. I know that now because the car runs the way it does. She looked at him. I knew it then because of the notes, the amount of reasoning behind each choice. Most of the specifications I'd seen before had numbers and references. Yours had arguments. He thought about the 7 months in Charlotte, about the decisions he'd made and the reasons he'd written down for each one. Not for anyone in particular, he hadn't known who would read them, or if anyone would. He'd written them because he thought clearly through writing and because the work deserved to know why it had been done the way it was. I always document the reasoning, he said. I could tell. She closed the notepad. That's unusual. It's the only way to know if you were right. She'd looked at him with the specific quality of someone recognizing a thing they'd been looking for. That had been the moment, he thought later, when the new commission had become real. Not the formal offer, not the card, that moment. When she'd understood that the documentation and the reasoning were the same quality as the engine itself, that they came from the same place in him and couldn't be separated. He drove home with that quality of the meeting still present, the particular aliveness of a conversation that had been about real things. He drove home through the late afternoon, through the familiar Connecticut landscape of highway and suburb, and the particular light of February, and thought about the meeting. about someone who had been wrong in a specific, demonstrable way and had shown up to say so without being asked, about the engine in the car and the documentation that would now accurately record where it came from, about Owen's surgery date on the kitchen calendar, about what it meant to do something with your whole competence and have it recognized, finally, as the thing it actually was. The news coverage had died down within 2 weeks, the way news coverage died down when the next story arrived. What remained was the automotive community's knowledge of the event, more durable, more specific, the kind of reputation that moved through professional networks without needing media amplification. The calls that came to the shop in the month after the settlement were from people who had heard the story through that network. Not journalists, engineers, collectors, one broker representing a client who wanted a level of powertrain work that most shops couldn't deliver. 3 commissions he'd accepted. 2 he'd declined because the timeline didn't work with Owen's recovery period. The commission from Diane he'd accepted pending a real contract. Claire had drafted it. His name on it. IP retention explicit. Payment terms clear. A second engine. Different platform. A specification conversation that had already started over email and had the quality of a collaboration between people who both knew what they were talking about. He hadn't expected to find himself in a professional relationship with the woman who'd made the public bet. He'd thought about it from several angles and arrived at the same conclusion each time. She'd been wrong about the bet. She'd paid it. She'd apologized without being asked. She'd sought to do the next thing correctly. That was a sequence he could work with. Not everyone who had been wrong stayed wrong. Some people learned the specific thing their mistake had to teach them and changed how they moved afterward. He'd been wrong enough times in his own life to recognize the difference between someone performing contrition and someone actually adjusting. Diane was adjusting. The IP record had been corrected in the provenance file. The engine design was documented as his work. The car had its true history on paper now, which meant the car was, in a specific but real sense, more complete than it had been before any of this happened. He found, to his slight surprise, that this mattered to him. Not the credit as such. He'd built things under silence for years without the credit bothering him. But the honesty of the record. The fact that what was true was now written down in the place where the truth of the thing belonged. That mattered. Owen's surgery was on a Thursday in February, exactly 6 weeks after the calendar date had been written in. The pre-surgical workup took 3 days. The family suite at the Philadelphia hospital was small but clean, with a window that showed a courtyard and a pull-out chair that Marcus slept on for 2 nights without complaint, because Owen needed him close and closeness was not negotiable. Owen had been matter-of-fact about all of it, in the way he was matter-of-fact about most things. Curious about the medical procedures. Interested in how the equipment worked. Asking the neurosurgeon questions that the surgeon answered with the slightly surprised courtesy of someone who expected children's questions to be simpler than they were. "What's the actual cutting like?" Owen asked at the pre-op meeting. "We make a small incision at the base of the spine," the surgeon said. "We use magnification to locate the filum terminale. Then we make a very precise cut to release it. With what kind of instrument? Microsurgical scissors. And you can tell the right place from the wrong place? Yes, the tissue looks different under magnification. The filum is identifiable." Owen considered this. "Okay," he said. The same okay Marcus had heard through his whole life. The okay that meant I've understood this and I'm integrating it, and we can proceed. The surgery took 4 hours and 11 minutes. Marcus sat in the waiting room and did things he'd done before in waiting rooms. Drank too much coffee, didn't read the magazine he'd brought, talked briefly to a nurse who came by to update him, said the words fine and thank you, and yes, I understand. The waiting room had other people in it, each absorbed in their own version of the same vigil, the specific quiet community of people who loved someone in surgery. He thought about 7 months alone in a shop in Charlotte, building something for someone he'd never meet. He thought about the foam-lined crate going onto a truck, He thought about the engine starting on the first crank at the Harrington Invitational, in a room full of people who didn't know what they were seeing. He thought about Owen waving from the top step of the bus. The surgeon came out at 2:47 in the afternoon. Everything went exactly as planned, he said. He explained the procedure, the findings, the expected recovery timeline. The film had been tethered in the standard pattern, straightforwardly accessible, cleanly released. No complications. Recovery would take 6 to 8 weeks for full healing, with activity restrictions for most of that. Within 3 months, Owen could expect to return to all normal activities without restriction. Marcus shook the surgeon's hand. He sat back down. The relief was not loud. It was the kind that moved through you slowly, like heat coming back into cold hands, incremental, pervasive, altering the temperature of everything gradually rather than all at once. He called his brother in Seattle. "It's done," he said. "Surgery went well." "Good," his brother said. The word was simple and complete. He called Owen's school and spoke to the principal, who asked how Owen was and sounded genuinely glad when Marcus told her. He ate the sandwich from the vending machine that he'd been staring at for 4 hours and had not eaten, because eating had seemed impossible while Owen was in surgery, and was now entirely possible. Owen was in the recovery room for 3 hours. When they brought Marcus in, his son was awake and groggy and had the specific careful quality of someone who was monitoring their own physical state with attention. He looked at Marcus. His expression ran through several things. "It's done?" he said. "It's done. Everything went perfectly." Owen closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them. "Good," he said. The same word as Marcus's brother. The same completeness in it. They stayed in Philadelphia for 4 more days, standard post-operative observation and initial physical therapy assessment. The physical therapist was direct with Owen about the recovery protocol, what he could and couldn't do, why, and what the timeline looked like for regaining full activity. Owen listened to all of it with the same focused quality he brought to the surgeon's explanations and asked questions that were better than average. The drive home was quiet. Owen slept most of it, which was normal for the medication schedule. Marcus drove through the February landscape, through New Jersey and then Connecticut, and let the miles accumulate. Diane's card was in the center console. He'd put it there when he'd gotten back in the car after their coffee shop meeting and hadn't moved it. He thought about the commission offer, about the conversation they'd had about the engine, the technical back and forth, the way she'd talked about wanting the provenance file to be complete. He thought about building something with his name on it, not a ghost contract, not a broker intermediary, just his name, his work, and the honest record of what he'd made. He pulled into the driveway at 7 in the evening. He woke Owen gently and helped him inside. Owen moved carefully but steadily. The stability he was showing was already better than pre-surgery. The subtle compensations he'd developed for the tethering already beginning to release. He got Owen settled. He made dinner. He sat across the table from his son and watched him eat carefully, conserving the energy that surgery had depleted, and felt the specific gratitude of someone who has been afraid for a long time and is no longer afraid. "Dad," Owen said. "Yeah, what happens now?" "With the car thing." "The story. It'll die down." "These things do." "And the work?" Marcus looked at his son. "I've got a potential new commission. Someone wants another engine." "The same woman?" "Yeah." Owen ate in silence for a moment. He had the expression he got when he was thinking about something from several angles. "Is that okay?" he said. "After all the stuff? I think she's trying to do it right this time," Marcus said. "So you'll do it?" He thought about Diane in the coffee shop, showing up without being asked, saying the apology without a legal document in the room. He thought about the card in the center console. He thought about building something with his name on it. "Probably," he said. Owen nodded. He finished his dinner. The karma was not complicated when you laid it out plainly. The enda that had been used to set him up had turned out to have no teeth. The IP rights he'd retained without knowing he'd retained them had given him a lever. The settlement had been fair, fairer than he'd expected, actually, with less fighting than he'd braced for. Diane Ashford had lost the bet, paid it without legal action, apologized without prompting, and offered new work on honest terms. The engine he'd built alone and shipped in a foam-lined crate would now have his name in the provenance file. The Harrington Invitational would become a story people told. The mechanic from Waterbury who started the car. The bet the billionaire lost. The engineer behind the mystery commission. He'd never sought any of it. He'd just been in the right room with the right knowledge and the right reason. Sometimes the work itself held the whole answer. Sometimes it always had. 2 weeks after Owen came home from Philadelphia, on a Saturday morning when the weather had begun the ambiguous work of deciding between late winter and early spring, Marcus opened the shop early. Not for any customer. He'd cleared the second bay the day before, moved the project car to the first bay, swept the floor, arranged the workbench with the careful order he used when he was starting something he cared about. He'd pulled the design notes for the Ashford engine from his files and read through them the night before, not to revisit the work, but to remember where it had come from, the thought process at each stage, the choices he'd made, and why. He was getting ready to start something new. Owen had wanted to come in that morning, which was not unusual. He'd been at the shop dozens of times over the years, not in the way of a child being dragged somewhere, but in the way of a kid who was genuinely curious about what his father did and had been allowed. From the time he was old enough to be trusted, to be present and ask questions and occasionally hand tools and understand what he was looking at. He was moving more easily now. Not full range yet. The recovery protocol was conservative for the first 8 weeks, but the compensations were gone. The subtle adjustments he'd made for years to accommodate the tension in his cord, the way he'd held his back slightly differently, the particular economy of movement that a body developing around a constraint developed, those were easing out. He moved more freely. The physical therapist had said this was typical, and had said it with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had expected this outcome and was pleased to see it. Owen stood in the doorway of the second bay and looked at the cleared workbench. "Starting something new?" he said. "Maybe," thinking about it. His son walked in, hands in his pockets, doing the circuit of the bay the way he always did, taking in the space first, the overall picture, then moving to specifics. He stopped at the workbench and looked at the design notes Marcus had spread out. He didn't touch them. He looked. "Is this the new one?" he said. "Preliminary stuff. Nothing committed yet." Owen looked at the notes for a while. He had the quality of someone reading a language they were learning, not fluent, but finding more than they expected to find. He'd been spending time in the shop for years. Things had accumulated. "The measurements are different," he said, "from the last big one. Different platform. Different requirements. You can't just copy an engine design and install it somewhere else. The environment changes the solution. Because the car is different. Because everything is different. The weight distribution, the heat rejection requirements, the power delivery curve the driver needs. You start from the problem, not from the previous answer." Owen absorbed this. He turned from the notes and looked at the empty bay, at the clean floor and the arranged tools and the space waiting for something to occupy it. "What kind of car is it for?" he said. "Don't know yet. That's the conversation I have before I start. But you've already started thinking about it." Marcus looked at his son. "Yeah, I have." Owen sat on the stool near the workbench, the one Marcus had put there years ago specifically because Owen had asked for somewhere to sit while he watched, and folded his hands in his lap and looked at the floor with the expression he got when he was putting something together from available pieces. "Dad," he said. "Yeah, what does an engine sound like when it's right? Like when you've done it perfectly?" Marcus thought about this, about the specific sound of the Ashford engine coming up through its idle on the first cold start test in Charlotte, about the quality of it, not the drama of a racing engine, not the growl that people associated with performance cars in movies. The actual sound of something built correctly, smooth even, a regularity that had nothing reluctant in it, the mechanical equivalent of a sentence that said exactly what it meant and nothing more. Like it's not working hard, he said. Like it has more than enough to do what you're asking, so what you're asking costs it nothing. He paused, like it's been waiting to do this. Owen was quiet for a moment. And the one in her car? He said. The one you built. Same thing. He looked at the notes on the workbench. Every engine I've built that I'm actually proud of has the same quality. You put the key in, or run the start sequence, whatever, and it comes up and you can hear it's not struggling. It has room. Room for what? For more than you're asking it for right now. Power you're not using. Capability that's there when you need it. He thought about how to say this plainly. You don't build an engine for what the car needs today. You build it for what the car might need when the driver finally figures out what they have. Owen turned this over. He had the specific internal expression of someone filing something away carefully, in a particular place for later use. Then he slid off the stool and walked to the workbench and looked at the design notes again, more carefully this time. Can you show me? He said. How it starts? The thinking. Marcus pulled a stool next to his son's. He opened the first page of the preliminary notes and pointed to the place he'd started. The problem statement, the constraints, the first principle from which everything else followed. Owen leaned in, shoulder against his father's shoulder, and looked at the page with the clear, curious attention of someone who wanted to understand. Outside, February was trying to become March. The morning light came in flat through the shop windows and lay across the concrete in long rectangles, moving with the day. From somewhere down the street came the sound of someone starting a car. Cold start, the slight roughness of an engine coming up from overnight, fuel trims adjusting, the idle settling as it found its running temperature. Owen looked up at the sound. He listened to it for a moment. That one sounds like it's working, he said. Little rough, Marcus agreed. Needs its injectors cleaned, probably. Can you tell from here? The pattern of the idle catch. The way the revs hunt a little before they settle. Owen listened to the car outside finishing its warm-up. The idle evening out. The driver finally pulling out of whatever driveway it had been in and moving away down the street. The sound diminished and then was gone. He looked back at the notes. Show me the pattern, he said. How you hear it. Marcus turned the first page. He began.